I work the night shift as a nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit. It's a demanding job, but one I'm passionate about. My nights are usually filled with the steady beeping of monitors, the hushed whispers of nurses, and the occasional cry of a young patient. It was around 3 a.m. when I found myself in the basement, hunting for a new gurney. Ours had been destroyed by a violent patient earlier in the evening, a rare but harrowing occurrence. The hospital was eerily quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of machinery. The basement storage unit was a cluttered labyrinth of medical equipment, old furniture, and forgotten supplies. I navigated through the narrow aisles, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. My thoughts were a mix of exhaustion and concern for my patients upstairs. I could still hear the cries of little Tommy, who had undergone surgery just yesterday. As I reached for a new gurney, I felt a gentle tug on my shirt. Startled, I assumed it had caught on something. I brushed it off and continued my search. But then, it happened again. Another tug, more insistent this time. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Then I heard it. A little girl's voice, crystal clear and hauntingly close. "I'm lost." I froze. My flashlight shook in my hand as I scanned the room. There was no one there. The voice had been so real, so distinct. I felt a surge of fear mixed with an overwhelming sense of empathy. I was used to dealing with the cries and pleas of children, but this was different. This voice didn't belong to any of my patients. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence. The basement was still and oppressive, the air thick with an unexplainable presence. I could feel my pulse in my throat, each beat louder than the last. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my radio and called my partner, Steve, who was working upstairs. "Hey, Steve, can you come down to the basement? I need help with the gurney," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sure thing. Be there in a minute," he replied, sounding puzzled. While waiting for Steve, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing, just shadows and the hum of the hospital's life support systems. When Steve finally arrived, his presence was a huge relief. I explained what happened, and he gave me a skeptical look but didn't press the issue. Together, we wheeled the gurney back upstairs. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see the owner of the voice. The experience in the basement felt surreal, like a half-remembered nightmare. But the lingering fear was real. That night, as I cared for my young patients, the little girl's voice echoed in my mind. "I'm lost." I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the depths of the hospital, a spirit was reaching out. It was a reminder of the many souls who had passed through its halls, each with their own story, each leaving a trace behind. And as I held the hand of a sleeping child, I whispered a silent promise to the unseen presence. "You're not alone. I'll help you find your way." My name is Dr. Emily Carter, a third-year resident specializing in internal medicine. I had always been fascinated by the human body and its myriad complexities, but nights like these made me question my career choices. The emotional and physical toll was immense, and sometimes I felt like I was running on fumes. Working night shifts as a resident doctor was a grueling but essential part of my training. The hours were long and unpredictable, and the stakes were always high. Most nights, if everything was under control, we could catch a few hours of sleep. However, the designated night duty rooms were often occupied, forcing us to find other places to rest. That particular night had been unusually calm. After ensuring all my patients were stable, I went in search of a vacant room to catch some sleep. I was exhausted, my body aching from the relentless pace of the past few weeks. I finally found an empty room on the 4th floor, one that seemed quiet and isolated. The room had 2 beds, one of which was occupied. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was appropriate to share the room with a patient, but the person appeared to be in a deep sleep and unattended. I settled into the unoccupied bed, feeling the stiffness in my muscles ease slightly as I lay down. The room was dimly lit by a small nightlight casting soft shadows on the walls. I glanced over at the other bed, where the patient lay completely still. Something about their stillness was unnerving, but I chalked it up to my exhaustion and closed my eyes, quickly drifting off to sleep. I woke up just as dawn was breaking, the first light of morning filtering through the blinds. The room felt different, colder somehow. I sat up, stretching my sore muscles, and glanced over at the other bed. It was empty. I realized no one was there in the washroom too. Confused, I got up and walked out into the hallway, looking for a nurse to ask about the patient who had been there last night. I found Nurse Helen at the nurse's station. She had been working here for over 20 years and knew everything about everyone. "Good morning, Helen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you tell me what happened to the patient in room 407? The bed was occupied last night, but it's empty now." Helen looked up from her paperwork, her expression puzzled. "Room 407? She repeated. "Dr. Carter, that bed has been empty for a week. The patient who was there passed away 7 days ago. We haven't had anyone in that room since." A chill ran down my spine. "But I saw someone there last night," I insisted. "They were lying in the bed, completely still." Helen's eyes widened, and she glanced at her colleague, who had overheard our conversation. "Are you sure, Emily? That room has been unoccupied. We haven't assigned any patients there since the death." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Had I imagined it? Was I so exhausted that my mind was playing tricks on me? But it had felt so real, the presence of someone else in that room, the sense of not being alone. "Maybe I was just overtired," I said weakly, trying to convince myself as much as Helen. "I must have imagined it." Helen nodded slowly, but her eyes were filled with concern. "You've been working too hard, Emily. Take it easy, okay? We don't need you getting sick too." I forced a smile and nodded, but the unease lingered. As I walked back to my duties, I couldn't shake the image of the still figure lying in that bed. The logical part of my brain tried to dismiss it as a hallucination, a trick of the light and my exhausted mind. But a deeper, more instinctual part of me knew that something inexplicable had happened in that room. That night haunted me for weeks. Every time I passed by room 407, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I never spoke of it to anyone else, fearing they would think I was losing my grip on reality. But I knew what I had seen, and the memory of that silent, ghostly presence would stay with me forever. A chilling reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. In 2004, my father suffered a severe stroke that left him unconscious for nearly 2 weeks. It was a harrowing time for our family. Without any insurance, we had to place him in a general ward with up to 7 other patients at a time, though typically there were 3 or 4. Despite the crowded conditions, I made it a point to visit him every day from morning until night, hoping my presence would bring him some comfort. My father was a strong, hard-working man, a mechanic by trade who had spent his life fixing cars and supporting our family. His sudden collapse was a shock to us all. Watching him lie there, helpless and vulnerable, was the most difficult thing I had ever faced. One of the patients sharing the ward was an elderly man in his mid to late 60s. His name was Mr. Thompson. He had a warm, kind demeanor and always greeted me with a smile whenever I walked in. His bed was directly in front of my father's, and over time, we developed a silent camaraderie born out of our shared circumstances. Mr. Thompson often received visits from his children and grandchildren, and I found comfort in the lively conversations and laughter that surrounded his bed. One afternoon, after a quick lunch break, I returned to the ward to find my father still sleeping. With nothing on the hospital TV to distract me, I settled into my usual chair, feeling the weight of exhaustion creeping in. I began to zone out, my eyes drifting towards Mr. Thompson's bed. His family was visiting, their voices a soothing hum in the background. As I sat there, something strange caught my attention. At first, it was just a faint movement, but as I focused, I noticed three shadowy figures floating above Mr. Thompson. They circled in a slow, deliberate pattern, like dark specters in a macabre dance. They looked like people wearing dark cloaks, but with no discernible hands or feet. They seemed to dive in and out of a hole that I couldn't see, disappearing and reappearing in an unsettling rhythm. I was stunned. My rational mind struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and even shook my head, but the figures remained. Then, one of the shadows broke off from the group and floated toward me. It got right in my face, its presence cold and menacing. Instinctively, I leaned back as far as I could in the chair, my heart pounding in my chest. After a moment that felt like an eternity, it floated back to the other two, and together they vanished through the back wall. I sat there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The logical part of my brain tried to dismiss the experience as a figment of my imagination, a product of stress and fatigue. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. The presence of those shadowy figures filled me with a sickening dread, a certainty that Mr. Thompson was going to die. That evening, Mr. Thompson, who had always seemed in good spirits despite his condition, began to complain of stomach pains. His family was concerned, but he assured them it was nothing serious. The next day, however, his condition worsened, and he was moved to a private room next to ours. I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom that had settled over me. The following morning, I ran into Mr. Thompson's daughter in the hallway. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. My heart sank as I approached her, already knowing what she was going to say. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her expression a mix of sorrow and disbelief. "My father died today," she said, her voice cracking. "He was fine, and then he just got sicker and died. We still don't know what happened." Her words echoed in my mind as I walked back to my father's room. The grief in her eyes was something I would never forget. I couldn't shake the feeling that those shadowy figures I had seen were somehow connected to Mr. Thompson's sudden decline. It was as if they had come to collect his soul, and I had been a helpless witness to their grim task. In the days that followed, I found myself questioning everything I had experienced. Was it a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion? Or had I truly glimpsed something beyond our understanding, a dark harbinger of death? The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it, but the fear and certainty I had felt in that moment were all too real. I continued my daily visits to my father, but the ward felt different without Mr. Thompson's presence. The lively conversations and laughter that had once filled the space were replaced by a somber silence. My father eventually regained consciousness and began his slow road to recovery. The doctors were amazed at his progress, and I was filled with gratitude for every moment I had with him. Years have passed since that fateful time, but the memory of those shadowy figures remains vivid in my mind. I never spoke of it to anyone, not wanting to sound like I had lost my grip on reality. But every now and then, when I find myself alone in a quiet room, I think of Mr. Thompson and the strange, dark shapes that heralded his end. It was a reminder of the fragility of life, the thin veil that separates us from the unknown. And as a nurse myself now, working in the same hospital where my father once lay, I carry that experience with me. It has made me more compassionate, more understanding of the fears and uncertainties that patients and their families face. Because I know that sometimes, the things we cannot explain are the ones that leave the deepest mark on our souls.